Hello, Human Sexuality class. Happy Tuesday. I think I just got finished grading everybody's modules 1 and 2, so good job. Quarter of the way through the class, I believe. There's only 8 modules, right? And you got 2 down. And the pattern will keep up with 2 each week, but you'll notice that they are opening as you go, so you can go as quickly through them as you want. The exams are kind of punctuated where they are, but a few of you have reached out and said, asked me if I could open them differently, and I'm okay with that. I wanted to touch base with you on also the diagrams. So please make sure that sometime after today, I think is when it'll open, I've given you the diagrams all completely filled in. Most of you did a great job. You'll notice I tweaked the language just here and there in places where you didn't lose points. You only lost points if you started accumulating numbers of incorrectly labeled parts. And I noticed 1 or 2 of you had some issues with the diagram. It looked like maybe all the arrows pitched a little bit. So if you wanted to correct that, you could, if you ended up losing points because I couldn't tell where things were pointing to. And then a couple of you went a little on your own and made new boxes and new arrows, which is not necessarily incorrect, but some of the things that were added, you might want to just double check that against the correct answers. What I really wanted to focus on in this video, though, is the idea of normalcy. And so when reading through your what is normal homework assignment, one of the things I always think is interesting is that learners want to position their understanding of normal from their own personal experiences. And even in a lot of your introductions, you said, I learned from my own personal sexual experiences. And that's a valid thing, and that's important, learning about your own personal sexuality. But the course is really designed to think about human sexuality holistically. And so what we learn from our own personal sexual experiences doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the sexual health or sexuality or sexual being of other people. So I want to encourage you to think a little bit more broadly outside of what you personally think. What you personally think is important and it's totally valid, but it's not necessarily the context of the course. So if we're thinking about what is normal, and again, nobody lost points for this, I just sort of want to draw your attention to this idea that many of you, and I know you can't read each other's responses, but a lot of you wrote about what you personally think is normal. And we would call that subjective assessment, right? So what you personally think is acceptable or appropriate or normal is how you define that. And that's subjective as opposed to objective, right? Where we might all look at something and say whether or not we think it is typical or atypical. And sometimes when we're using the word normal, we actually mean moral, which would not be correct. And we're breaking down semantics here, but that's because it's important, right? So something like pedophilia would be abnormal statistically, if we look at it that way. The average person is not attracted to young people in terms of sexual arousal. And a lot of people would also consider that to be amoral. It's technically also illegal if we wanted to continue to add labels to it. But there are other things that are statistically abnormal, like being married as an adult in the United States. The majority of adults in the United States are not legally married. So that would be statistically abnormal, but not necessarily amoral, not illegal, so on and so forth, right? So we want to think about those distinctions. So if we think about them back, we have statistically, so what from a percentage standpoint, what do the norms sort of show us in terms of, and I'm saying norms again, which isn't helpful, but how do we look at what the broad population is doing? And you'll remember the little bell curve, right, with the standard deviations, and some of us are real comfortable being those outliers out in those less typical spaces. And the majority of folks will generally clump in the center no matter what it is we are talking about. So that's statistically normal. Subjectively and objectively, we've also looked at, right? In terms of do I personally think versus what does everyone think? If we were in class, I'd be talking about pie, right? I'd be asking you, what is the best flavor of pie? I'll give you a second to contemplate that. And that's like, okay, but based on what? And I might say my grandma's recipe, my own personal tastes, like again, what do most Americans or most people in the world think is the best pie? And so just think about how those labels apply differently. Medically normal seems like a cut and dry one, but it's actually pretty abstract, and we'll notice that more as we go up throughout the semester. That medically normal, from a physical standpoint, is sometimes a little bit easier than a psychological or emotional. So if we asked, for example, like what is a medically normal amount of orgasming to participate in, there really isn't an answer for that. Even if we asked about a medically normal erection, you're not going to get a good scientific answer. You know, when folks are receiving a prescription like Viagra or Cialis for erectile differences, difficulties, whatever, dysfunction, whatever word you want to use, that diagnosis is based on the fact that that person's penis doesn't respond in the way that they would like it to. It doesn't respond as quickly as they would like, or it doesn't stay firm for as long as that person would like. But my, again, PhD doctor, right, not the MD doctor, asks, well, based on what? Like, are those person's perceptions realistic? So if that person wants an erection to last for 8 hours, that might require medicine. Is that a normal diagnosis then of erectile difficulty or dysfunction, versus someone that might say, I would like my penis to be erect for 2 to 5 minutes, which is the general normal amount of concentrated intercourse behavior or sexual behavior involving a penis. And so that one becomes a little bit funny, right? And then even if we look at like the mental emotional stuff, as we'll see moving forward, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychological Association essentially looks at what all of our diagnoses are for social, emotional, mental health disorders. But those again are just figured out by a bunch of physicians sitting in conference deciding what they want to classify as normal or abnormal or healthy or unhealthy or typical or atypical. Sexual identity would be a great example of that. It wasn't that long ago where being gay, lesbian, trans, asexual, so on and so forth, any identity outside of heterosexual, biological, cisgendered men and women being together was considered a mental defect, which we know not to be the case once science improved. And so we also need to think about medically normal, just a little critically, right? Does one testicle hang a little bit lower than the other? Yes, that's medically normal. And the same that one breast might hang a little bit differently than the other breast. It doesn't signify something is medically atypical. If something is oozing or itching or pussing or hurting, that might be medically atypical. So that might be something you want to reach out to see a physician for. Perceptions are everything, but we have to keep in mind when we're talking about perceptions that those are personal identities. Those are ways in which we see the world that may or may not be accurate, right? Perhaps someone have posed to you, and this should be in the slides, although I'm not confident that I updated them, the idea of, is the glass half empty or is it half full, right? And then our optimistic or pessimistic self will respond to that. I'll give you a second to think about how you would answer that question. I wish I had a glass half empty or half full to show you, right? But the truth of the matter is the glass is probably all the way full, maybe half of liquid and half of air, if we really want to think about that. So we see it halfway full of liquid, but it's also halfway full of air. But our perception is, oh, it's half full, I need more wine or milk or water or vodka or whatever it is. Or it's half empty, like someone drank it, right? But it's actually full of, as I said, fluid as well as gas. So again, that perception is always going to be affecting how we think about our content as we move forward. Even as you're going through the next module, especially as you go through the next module, when you start to think about gender and what gender is. And I'll approach that subject when we get there. But I want you to always be checking, what is my own personal perception, which you are totally entitled to and is very valuable, and then also what other realities might be there, what other ways of seeing it might be there, what other ways of thinking it might be there. So you're all doing great. I'm so pleased with the level of engagement in the course. I encourage you to keep going and to keep reaching out, and I will keep punctuating with these little mini videos. I'm going to stop now because I already went over what I gave myself was like a 5-minute time limit. So good to see your faces. Glad to hear all your work that you're doing in the course. I really appreciate it. And I will talk to you again soon. All right. Take care.